I look back at the 1990s, and often it seems like a dream to me that I lived in that decade, because being 50 years old means I was 15 in 1990 and 24 in 1999. And now it seems like another lifetime ago. Like, wow, did I really live then? And did I do the things I did back then? But yeah, it did happen. And I just thought I would get on here and talk about it, because the 90s, I feel like, was a really cool decade. Because if you were born when I was born in 75, living during that time, you can remember there being no cell phones, no internet for most of the decade, and clearly remember what it was like to have to interact with people in work, school, just out in society without the devices today. It was a lot different, because I probably didn't have my first cell phone until it might have been around 1997 or 98. And even when I got the cell phone, the first one I had was like a brick. Actually, a coworker, I worked at this bingo hall back then. I've had some interesting jobs over the years, but a coworker gave me, and a friend of mine at that time gave me this phone. And back then, cell phones were very expensive, so most people still did not have them. And that particular phone, I want to say it cost like $10 or $15 for 30 minutes, for like a 30-minute card. So when I got that phone, I thought it was kind of interesting to have, but I would use it for emergencies. So I was like, oh, this would be interesting to have if you break down on the road. Or think about that. Today we are so used to having these little computers on us that we would feel unsafe probably without it, because we break down on the road, we're stranded, we have emergencies. These days, most places you get a tower. There's probably still places you can't get a tower. You can be isolated enough that the cell phone can't reach to call out or text or something. There are still those instances, or for some reason you break your phone or the battery dies or something. But you have better chances now of getting help if something's going on with a cell phone. Where back then, you would have to try to find a payphone somewhere, and that's if you didn't break down in some remote area. So, I remember getting that phone and thinking, okay, something happens, I have these limited amount of minutes, I might can get a hold of somebody. But I had a home phone at that time, around 1997 or so. I lived in a boarding house. I lived in this house I paid like $85 a week, and we had cable provided, we had a home phone provided. I shared a big part of this house where I shared the kitchen with another roommate. We had a pool out back. Just to give you an idea, I paid very little for this. Today, that would probably be unheard of. It's like $340 a month, I think, I paid for all of this. Power was provided as well. The utilities were all provided. I had my own phone line, though, also put in, so I didn't have to share a home phone line. But the point is, long distance still existed. So the cell phones were real expensive, like I say, so you still needed to really use your home phone still for your main calls, and there was still long distance charges. And if you had something like voicemail connected to your phone, that was a charge. So all of this was more, all of that kind of stuff. The rent that I had for where I lived was cheap, but the phone situation back then was really expensive, unless you had the most basic phone with no voicemail and you didn't call long distance to anybody. So it was still one of those things where the internet had not really come up for everybody yet. It was on the verge of it. It still seemed like your community of people you would deal with, well, it was like this before the internet. Your community of people you dealt with, everybody you would ever date, everybody you would ever see, everybody you were friends with was going to be in the city you lived in, the town you lived in, right there where you were at. Only people traveled and went to other places and went to other countries and things like that, but you didn't have all these dating sites, you didn't have Instagram, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have all these different ways now that we connect with people from around the world. So it was just so much different on communication. And when the internet came up, that was around what I remember, 98 maybe, that I really remember it becoming a big thing, somewhere around then with AOL. And it was dial-up. And if you know anything about the beginnings of the internet, it was very slow. You had to have a computer with a tower, and it was a dial-up thing. So it would make a screeching noise and a screeching noise as it was dialing up through a phone line to get you onto the internet. And yeah, it was interesting at first because you could, you suddenly realized you could look up all this information. And you suddenly realized that you could go into these chat rooms. That was the first way that people were starting to mass communicate out of their cities and places, was through what I remember as AOL chat rooms, where you would go into a room and it would be the major cities that had them, but you could go into any of these major cities, and if it was like New York or LA or Chicago or something like that, it might have 2 or 3 chat rooms because they would fill up. And it's basically like how you see text today. Everything's scrolling and people are talking with a screen name all in this one room. But people would meet up, like if people got interested in one another in there, then they might exchange their email or something in the chat room. And they would start emailing, that you could email with a person back and forth. So you can see how this all kind of started. And it was primitive, very primitive compared to what everything has become today. But I remember going into the AOL chat rooms and everything you accessed on the internet being on a computer and tower that you had to have at home, which these things were very expensive. And I don't really remember laptops becoming a thing until not in the 90s. Not to say they didn't exist, but I just don't remember it being a thing. But let me go back to earlier. We're talking about before the internet and before cell phones in the 90s. People, there's a charm and a peace I look back at in knowing people just couldn't get a hold of you all the time. Like my friends would try to call me at home and realize, oh, I'm not home. They don't know your schedule. They know where you work. They call you at work. I worked at this grocery store in the early 90s. And my boss, of course, we wasn't supposed to get phone calls at work. They would tolerate a few. I was a grocery stocker. And sometimes I remember somebody calling me at work, and I would get a page over the intercom in the grocery store that I had a phone call. But the point is, people would have to like call you at home. If you didn't have an answering machine or a voicemail or something, they couldn't leave a message. But if they did leave a message, you got it when you got home. You couldn't check it because you didn't have a cell phone. There's no way to check it till you got home. Or they called you at work, not knowing sometimes if you were at work. So everything was more of a guessing game. If people couldn't get a hold of you, they just couldn't get a hold of you. And it might be a mystery as to where you're at that day, but that's just the way it was. But there was a certain peace in that, because look at today where everybody's carrying a phone, a device, a computer, and even employers have become obsessed with this idea that they should be able to get a hold of you all the time, which I've had battles with employers over this. I don't shy away from that. I'm like, no, you don't own me because I have a device and we all have devices. Does it not mean I have to answer your phone calls? There's some people that disagree with me on this, because some people totally bow down and worship the corporate entities of our country and workplaces, no matter what they do to them. I'm not one of these people. I set boundaries, and I've done this with workplaces now for a little while, because they're in my experience, they can be very abusive if you don't especially if you don't set any boundary from the beginning of an employment somewhere. So anyway, back then though, employers, they call you. They couldn't really say much because they called you at home. You didn't have to answer the phone. If you had caller ID, you knew who was calling. That's the only thing. You would need caller ID or an answering machine to see who's going to leave a message if you were thinking an employer was going to call you in. But if an employer couldn't get a hold of you, they couldn't get a hold of you. And that was the end of that. Nowadays, of course, they think a lot of them will cross boundaries with you in that way, and they want to, they get mad if you don't answer a phone, or get mad if you don't get back with them because I know you have a phone, this and that. But for me, it's like I have a life outside your workplace. I don't have to do anything except show up to my scheduled shifts and be on time for those and what I've agreed to do. But that was something I liked about back then, is people just didn't have constant access, and they didn't feel entitled. A lot of people feel entitled to have constant access to you, not just employers. Or you could have friends, or you could have parents, or you could have other people that may feel entitled that you should answer them because they feel like we all have these devices on us at all times. Now, going back to that time, say early 90s too, I was in a band. And I think about that a lot. And I think about how today bands have so many tools because of the internet. They can literally take an iPhone, and it don't have to be just an iPhone, but they can take a good phone and record a demo, a decent probably demo right there, and put it down in the floor in a room and probably get a decent demo because you have all these tools that you can have on the phone too for mixing or whatever nowadays, where back then, man, it was so hard if you didn't have some decent equipment to record a demo. We would record stuff on cassettes. Didn't have YouTube available, so that's the other tool today. Bands make their own YouTube channel, get exposure. You didn't have any of that back then in the early mid-90s. So it was literally, you had to have word of mouth. You had to get out there in front of people. We had house parties. We played a couple of gigs here and there. You networked with people, and you tried to get in with people in the local band scene. And I lived in Memphis, Tennessee at that time. I lived there in the time that I'd say the biggest rock band of that time, which we during the time we were playing then would have been Saliva that had come up in Memphis during that time. But you had to network with people. You had to try to get in with whoever. And then to record a demo, a cassette wasn't going to do it if you wanted anybody to take you seriously. So you needed to be able to go to a place and have somebody record you on mixing equipment in a studio. You had to kind of do that, or you needed to have the equipment yourself, which was very expensive to have. So that was always a struggle for us. And I just think about today, it's much easier for bands to be able to get recognition, network through the internet. You can do a lot more without having to just physically do it all out in public. You need to do stuff in public, but it's not all reliant on that now like it was back then. The music of that time is something else I think about. I feel like the videos, I'm going back looking at songs from that time, 90s music, alternative in particular, I've been looking at here lately. I think, well, of course, you got the mainstream acts like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. I love Alice in Chains. I like a little bit of Nirvana, a little bit of Pearl Jam, particularly their first two albums I liked. But like going back listening to various things back then, like Offspring, Live, Sonic Youth, some bands I'm learning more about, like Ministry, Veruca Salt, I saw in concert actually, but didn't know much about them. What's weird is they actually opened at a show I saw, which was Black Sabbath with Ozzy, and one of their, might have been their first reunion, extended reunion tours they did around 97, I think. And Godsmack. It's kind of an interesting bill for Veruca Salt opening that show. But I've listened to them recently. Went back and listened to, remember this song Cannonball by the Breeders, Bull in the Heather by Sonic Youth, some Weezer. There's so many. But the point is, I go back and I see some of these, we can look up all these videos on YouTube, which is amazing. And you see that, I guess what I would say is, it's a time capsule. I feel like those videos, a lot of those videos, they really capture the mood of that decade. They really do, for what I remember that decade being, that alternative scene being. Going back and looking at these videos and songs, these artists from that time, it really is a time capsule and captures the mood and the era. I think of The Crow, the movie The Crow with Brandon Lee, and no, I have not watched the remake. I don't want to judge it completely. It's a movie that if it comes up and I can watch it, it's not something I want to pay to watch. I would check it out though if it was available just to see, and I didn't pay to watch it and see if it's any good, but the reviews it got, I was like, it's hard to remake a masterpiece like The Crow. Brandon Lee was amazing in that movie. And of course there is a energy around it too, because of the accident on set that killed him. That left a certain feel to the movie. But his charisma, he completed most of the movie, and they had to do some of it. They had to finish some scenes with stunt doubles and some CGI, which is amazing that they could use for that era. That was really hard to do in the early 90s. I think that movie came out in 94, and they did a very good job at putting his face. It was at least a couple of scenes they put his face on a stunt double, and it worked very well. The only other movie I can think, another great movie of that era where they used great CGI that was ahead of its time for that era, would have been Terminator 2 Judgment Day. I think that's a classic too. The first two Terminators, but of course Terminator 2 relates to this because it came out, I think, in 91. And for 91 to do what they were doing in that movie, the computer graphics was amazing. And the story was fantastic. But going back to The Crow, the soundtrack is iconic and captures the mood of the era. It really, looking back to me, the Crow soundtrack, if you like 90s, if you like alternative, if you like the nostalgia, then you know what I'm talking about. Because most people that are into that era, they'll be like, yeah, the Crow soundtrack was amazing and very well put together. And I've went back and listened to, I had always heard about a couple of bands like Ministry and Baruch Assault and My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, which they are on the Crow soundtrack. And I love the song After the Flesh that's on there, but I never really listened much to them. It's interesting now, I'm going back, which one of my friends, she's introduced me to some of these things again, or these bands again, and I'm like, oh yeah, let me, I never really delved into their music a lot, and I'm liking some of the songs that I have not heard, going back and exploring, because I love all kinds of music. But I guess I just wanted to say 90s alternative to me really associates a lot with that era, and certain songs with me associate with that era. And for some reason, one that really comes to mind, maybe because it really captured a mood for me during that time, and it's from more mainstream band of that time, would be Pearl Jam. There's a song called, off their second album, Versus, called Rearview Mirror. And I used to play that song a lot back then when that I had that cassette when it first came out, and loved that song, Rearview Mirror. But the 90s, going back to just socializing with people, I remember when I worked in that grocery store, talking about, again, not having cell phones, not having internet, things would happen organically. We're talking about when people would try to call you and couldn't get a hold of you, things like that. Well, I would be at work, say, any given night. Now, especially the weekend, this would happen. So I met the guitar player that I ended up in a band with when I was 17 years old, working at this grocery store called Cecil's in Memphis. It was in a part of Memphis called Raleigh, which I've heard now Raleigh and Frazier, the places that I mainly hung out in Memphis, are very, very dangerous now. They were kind of dangerous then, but not near what I hear they are now. Memphis as a whole is much more dangerous of a city than the 1990s. But back then, I grew up more in the Frazier area of Memphis and Raleigh, and hung out in places like Bartlett. If anyone knows about Memphis, that's why I bring some of this stuff up. I went to places as a teenager like the Mall of Memphis, which was in that day and time referred to as the Mall of Murder. Pretty grim. I want to say it got tore down eventually, and they created the Wolf Chase Galleria out in Bartlett. And from what I understand, it was a great mall back in that time. We liked going to it when they built it, but I understand now it's crime-ridden. It eventually ended up that way. But going back to Cecil's, the grocery store, I met the guitar player there, and we had a group of friends. I think a couple other people that worked there at the grocery store, and then they knew people that knew people. This is how things worked back then. People knew people that knew people. You met someone, they introduced you to their friend groups, and next thing you know, all of you are hanging out together. And what would happen is, especially on the weekend, people would just show up toward the end of, a couple of us are working, they know when we get off, they're going to show up out in the parking lot. We get off work, we're in our work clothes, we go out to our cars, we're all gathered around in the back end of the parking lot, hanging out, cutting up. And sometimes you would just, simple things like that. Sometimes you would sit out there for an hour or two. Sometimes the manager would come out from the grocery store and say, y'all gotta leave. We were never causing any trouble. We would be out, like I said, by the back end of the lot, but sometimes we had this manager that it would get under his skin. He'd want us all to disband and leave. But this is what we would do. And then we would decide while we're out there hanging out, where do we want to go? Where do we want to drive? Whose house do we want to go to? Is there a party going on anywhere? And that's what would happen. And you would organically migrate somewhere else. Sometimes you might want to go to one of your friends' houses just to see if they're home. I don't know if this kind of thing goes on much anymore. But that's what you would do. Sometimes you might just go over to a person's house and knock on their door and see if they're there on the weekend. You might be out driving around and say, oh, I'm going to stop by at so-and-so. Let's see if they're home. Nobody thought anything of it. They're either home or they're not, or if they lived there with parents or somebody else, they'd be like, oh no, they're gone, or they're here, or whatever. So we would do that. You might just drive around and see who's home and who's not, and who's doing what, who's getting into what, because you didn't have the cell phones to call people. I knew maybe 2 people that had a pager, and that was the drummer of our band and a girlfriend of that time. I had a pager because it was funny. I would page her at school, and she would skip school. So I would page her. She would call me from a payphone at school to come get her. But other than that, I didn't really know people. So there were some people carrying pagers, but like I said, not many. The other thing that would happen organically is with our band. We would decide on the day sometimes we wanted to have a party. It'd be the weekend. We'd say, you know what? Let's call some people and have a party tonight. We'll get some beer and we're just gonna play here in the house. And we did. We had our equipment set up, and we lived in 2 different houses. This first house we lived in was in a residential neighborhood, so sometimes we got noise ordinance tickets from the Memphis police. Not all the time, but it happened sometimes. Basically, we would have our equipment set up in the living room. We had lighting set up, actually. We had this guy, friend of ours, that would come over, and he had rigged up running these lights with light switches on a board he made. And we would have people just come in and squeeze into the living room area and dining room area and play live music right there. And we would call people that we knew that would call their friends. And next thing you know, we're opening the gate to our backyard to park cars in. So it was, that's the way things happened back then. You called people who called people on the day sometimes, and they would show up. There was no texting or whatever. You just had to get a hold of a few people, and they had to get a hold of a few people. So it was just, I look back at it in ways of how it was just really a simpler time, I feel like. Now, does that mean that I don't like my cell phone? I'm talking to you on it. So, of course, I've been addicted to this thing before. I've been addicted to devices. I've had the same issue a lot of people have had. But I guess I just wanted to say it's just interesting. I can remember clearly remember how it was being a younger adult that uh, didn't have the cell phones or the technology. So I just thought I'd get on here and share some of my experiences with that. And feel free to let me know what you think. Maybe you lived in that time at the same age I was, or maybe you're just nostalgic for that era, or whatever. But I'll talk to you guys later on. Bye.